The outline of history, being a plain history of life and mankind by H.G. Wells, revised and brought up to the end of the Second World War by Raymond Postgate, with maps and plans by J. Corbin, Volume 1, Book 5, Chapter 27, The Khazars Between the Sea and the Great Plains, Section 1, A Short Catalogue of Emperors, Section 2, Roman Civilization at its Zenith, Section 3, Characteristics of Art under the Roman Empire, Section 4, A Certain Dullness of the Roman Imagination, Section 5, The Stir of the Great Plains, Section 6, The Western through Roman Empire, Crumples Up, Section 7, The Eastern by Hellenic Empire, Section 1, Western writers are apt, through their patriotic predispositions, to overestimate the organization, civilizing work, and security of the absolute monarchy that established itself in Rome after the accession of Augustus Caesar. From it we derive the political traditions of Britain, France, Spain, Germany, and Italy, and these countries loom big in the perspectives of European writers. They ignore what Rome destroyed in the East. By the scale of a world history, the Roman Empire ceases to seem so overwhelmingly important. It lasted about 4 centuries in all before it was completely shattered. The Byzantine Empire was no genuine continuation of it. It was a damaged resumption of the Hellenic Empire of Alexander. It spoke Greek. Its monarch had a Roman title, no doubt, but so, for that matter, had the late Tsar of Bulgaria. Mesopotamia developed for the most part upon lines of its own during the Roman period. Its recent Hellenic acquisitions were extensively modified by the genius of the Persian and Parthian peoples, and in India and China, the influence of Rome was infinitesimal. During its 4 centuries of life, the Empire of Rome had phases of division and complete chaos. Its prosperous years, if they are gathered together and added up, do not amount in all to a couple of centuries, compared with the quiet, steady expansion, the security, and the civilizing task of the contemporary Chinese Empire, or with Egypt between 4000 and 1000 BCE, or with Sumer before the Semitic conquest. This amounts to a mere incident in history. The Persian Empire of Cyrus, again, he's called Kurash in the older text, which reached from the Hellespont to the Indus, had as high a standard of civilization, and its homelands remained unconquered and fairly prosperous for over 200 years. Its predecessor, the Median Empire, had endured for half a century. After a brief submergence by Alexander the Great, it rose again as the Seleucid Empire, which endured for some centuries. The Seleucid dominion shrank at last to the west of the Euphrates and became a part of the Roman Empire. But Persia, revived by the Parthians as a new Persian Empire, first under the Arsacids and then under the Sassanids, outlived the Empire of Rome, became a refuge from Western suppression and a hotbed of religious ideas. The Sassanids repeatedly carried war into the Byzantine Empire and held the line of the Euphrates steadfastly. In 616 of the Common Era, under Khosroes II, they were holding Damascus, Jerusalem, and Egypt, and threatening the Hellespont. But there has been no tradition to keep alive the glories of the Sassanids. The reputation of Rome has flourished through the prosperity of her heirs. The tradition of Rome looms far greater than the reality. The coalescence of the earlier civilizations had occurred, and civilization had spread westward. Semite and Aryan mingled, without combining, in a seething development round the basin of the Mediterranean, and the Roman administration was flung like a net that broke and was mended again, and at last broke altogether over the whole interplay. Now, eventually, they developed that thing where they said, oh, it's only the one tribe and they don't breed and all this other stuff, but they most definitely mingled just like other peoples mingled. History distinguishes several groups of Roman emperors who were great administrators. The first of these groups began with Augustus Caesar, 27 BCE to 14 of the Common Era, the Octavian of the previous section, who worked hard at the reorganization of the provincial governments and at financial reform. He established a certain tradition of lawfulness and honesty in the bureaucracy, and he restrained the more monstrous corruptions and tyrannies by giving the provincial citizen the right to appeal to Caesar. And the Bible mentions that about Paul, right? But he fixed the European boundaries of the empire along the Rhine and Danube, so leaving Germany, which is the necessary backbone of a safe and prosperous Europe, to barbarism. And he made a similar limitation in the east at the Euphrates, leaving Armenia independent to be a constant bone of contention with the Arsacids and the Sassanids. It is doubtful whether he considered that he was fixing the final boundaries of the empire along these lines, or whether he thought it desirable to consolidate for some years before any further attempts at expansion. Tiberius, 14 to 37 of the Common Era, is also described as a capable ruler, but he became intensely unpopular in Rome, and it was alleged that he was addicted to gross and abominable vices, but his indulgence in these and his personal tyrannies and cruelties did not interfere with the general prosperity of the empire. It is difficult to judge him. Nearly all our sources of information are manifestly hostile to him. Caligula, 37 to 41 of the Common Era, was insane, but the empire carried on during 4 years of his eccentricity at its head. Finally, he was murdered in his palace by his servants, and there seems to have been an attempt to restore the senatorial government, an attempt which was promptly suppressed by the household legions. Claudius, 41 to 54 of the Common Era, the uncle of Caligula, upon whom the choice of the soldiers fell, was personally uncouth, but he seems to have been a hard-working and fairly capable administrator. He advanced the westward boundary of the empire by annexing the southern half of Britain. He was poisoned by Agrippina, the mother of his adopted son Nero. You know, number value 666. 616 in the other spelling. So both the numbers in the Book of Revelation work. And a woman of great charm and force of character. Nero, 54 to 68. Tiberius is credited with monstrous vices and cruelties, but the empire had acquired sufficient momentum to carry on through his 14 years of power. He certainly murdered his devoted but troublesome mother and his wife, the latter, as a mark of devotion to a lady, Papa'a, who then married him. But the domestic infelicities of the Caesars are no part of our present story. Then why do they get hinted at, right? The reader greedy for criminal particulars must go to the classical source, Suetonius. These various Caesars and their successors and their womenkind were probably no worse, essentially, than most weak and passionate human beings, but they had no real religion, being themselves gods. They had no wide knowledge on which to build high ambitions. Their women were fierce and often illiterate, and they were under no restraints of law or custom. I'm sure they were to a degree, but, you know, they had their outlets, like the modern individuals that replaced chivalry. They were surrounded by creatures ready to stimulate their slightest wishes and to translate their vaguest impulses into action. What are mere passing black thoughts and angry impulses with most of us became therefore deeds with them. Before a man condemns Nero as a different species of being from himself, he should examine his own secret thoughts very carefully. Nero became intensely unpopular in Rome, and it is interesting to note that he became unpopular not because he murdered and poisoned his intimate relations, but because there was an insurrection in Britain under a certain Queen Boadicea, and the Roman forces suffered a great disaster in 61 of the Common Era, and because there was a destructive earthquake in southern Italy, the Roman population, true to its Etruscan streak, never religious and always superstitious, did not mind a wicked Caesar, but it did object strongly to an unperpetuous one. The Spanish legions rose in insurrection under an elderly general of 73, Galba, whom they acclaimed emperor. He advanced upon Rome, carried in a litter. Nero, hopeless of support, committed suicide in 68 of the Common Era. Galba, however, was only one of a group of would-be emperors. The generals in command of the Rhine legions, the Palatine troops, and the eastern armies each attempted to seize power. Rome saw 4 emperors in a year: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian IV. Vespasian, 69 to 79, from the eastern command, had the firmest grip and held and kept the prize. But with Nero, the line of Caesars born or adopted ended. Caesar ceased to be the family name of the Roman emperors and became a title. Demas Caesar, the Caesar god. Well, I know it's spelled with a Q as well. But what does the term itself mean? Because names used to mean something. The monarchy took a step forward toward Orientalism by an increased insistence upon the worship of the ruler. So ended the first group of Caesars, just 95 years of them. Now, that's part of the reason why Christianity and some stuff rose to prominence, because people were like, that's nonsense, worshiping just who happens to be the king and all that stuff. Well, Christianity became a sort of separation of the idea, but along the same lines, you could say. Vespasian, 69 to 79 of the Common Era, and his sons Titus, 79 of the Common Era, and Domitian, 81 of the Common Era, constitute, as it were, a second dynasty, the Flavian. Then, after the assassination of Domitian, came a group of emperors related to one another, not by blood but by adoption. The adoptive emperors, Nerva, 96 of the Common Era, was the first of this group, and Trajan, 98 of the Common Era, the second. They were followed by the indefatigable Hadrian, 117 of the Common Era, Antoninus Pius, 138 of the Common Era, and Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 of the Common Era. Wasn't 180 the year that the Catholic Church was officially a historical entity? Under both the Flavians and the Antonines, the boundaries of the empire crept forward again. North Britain was annexed in 84 of the Common Era. The angle of the Rhine and Danube was filled in, and what is now Transylvania was made into a new province, Dacia. Trajan also invaded Parthia and annexed Armenia, Assyria, and Mesopotamia. Under his rule, the empire reached its maximum extent. Hadrian, his successor, was of a cautious and retractile disposition. He abandoned these new eastern conquests of Trajan, and he also abandoned North Britain. He adopted the Chinese idea of the limiting wall against barbarism, an excellent idea so long as the pressure of population on the imperial side of the wall is greater than the pressure from without, but worthless otherwise. He built Hadrian's Wall across Britain and a palisade between the Rhine and the Danube. The full tide of Roman expansion was past, and in the reign of his successor, the northern European frontier was already actively on the defensive against the aggression of Teutonic and Slavic tribes. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus is one of these figures in history about which men differ widely and intensely. To some critics, he seems to have been a priggish person. He dabbled in religions and took a pleasure in conducting priestly ceremonies in priestly garments, a disposition offensive to common men. Now, depends on where, I guess. And they resent his alleged failure to restrain the wickedness of his wife, Faustina. Now, people have their own choices, but some cultures, they use the word pimp for the guy that doesn't say no to his wife, daughter, mother, etc., going out immodest or whatever. May not be able to stop her, but he should at least, express his disapproval of such things. And the stories of his domestic infelicity, however, rest on no very good foundations, though certainly his son, Commodus, was a startling person for a good home to produce. On the other hand, he was unquestionably a devoted and industrious emperor, pulling social order together through a series of disastrous years of vile weather, great floods, failing harvest, and famine, barbaric raids and revolts, and at last a terrible universal pestilence, says F.W. Farrar, quoted in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. He regarded himself as being, in fact, the servant of all, the registry of the citizens, the suppression of litigation, the elevation of public morals, the care of minors, the retrenchment of public expenses, the limitation of gladiatorial games and shows, the care of roads, the restoration of senatorial privileges, the appointment of none but worthy magistrates, even the regulation of street traffic. These and numberless other duties so completely absorbed his attention that in spite of indifferent health, they often kept him at severe labor from early morning till long after midnight. His position, indeed, often necessitated his presence at games and shows, but on these occasions he occupied himself either in reading or being read to, or in writing notes. He was one of those who held that nothing should be done hastily, and that few crimes were worse than waste of time. Well, wasting time is where things start, right? But it is not by these industries that he is now remembered. He was one of the greatest exponents of the Stoical philosophy, and in his meditations jotted down in camp and court, he has put so much of a human soul on record as to raise up for himself in each generation a fresh series of friends and admirers. With the death of Marcus Aurelius, this phase of unity and comparatively good government came to an end, and his son Commodus inaugurated an age of disorder. Practically, the empire had been at peace within itself for 200 years. Now, for 100 years, the student of Roman history must master the various criminology of a number of inadequate emperors. While the frontier crumbled and receded under barbarian pressure, one or two only seem to have been able men. Such were Septimius, Severus, Aurelian, and Probus. Septimius Severus was a Carthaginian, and his sister was never able to master Latin. She conducted her Roman household in the Punic language, which must have made Cato the elder turn in his grave. The rest of the emperors of this period were chiefly adventurers, too unimportant to the general scheme of things for us to note. At times there were separate emperors ruling in different parts of the distracted empire. From our present point of view, the Emperor Decius, who was defeated and killed during the great raid of the Goths into Thrace in 251 of the Common Era, and the Emperor Valerian, who, together with the great city of Antioch, was captured by the Sassanid Shah of Persia in 260 of the Common Era, are worthy of notice because they mark the insecurity of the whole Roman system and the character of the outer pressure upon it. So too is Claudius, the conqueror of the Goths, because he gained a great victory over these people at Nish in Serbia, 269 of the Common Era, and because he died like Pericles of the plague. Through all these centuries, intermittent pestilences were playing a part in weakening races and altering social conditions, a part that still has to be properly worked out by historians. There was, for instance, a great plague throughout the empire between the years 164 and 180 of the Common Era in the reign of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. It probably did much to disorganize social life and prepare the way for the troubles that followed the accession of Commodus. The same pestilence devastated China, as we shall note in section 5 of this chapter. Considerable fluctuations of climate had also been going on in the 1st and 2nd centuries, producing stresses and shiftings of population whose force historians have still to appraise. But before we go on to tell of the eruptions of the barbarians and the attempts of such later emperors as Diocletian, 284 of the Common Era, and Constantine the Great, 306, to hold together the heaving and splitting vessel of the state, we must describe something of the conditions of human life in the Roman Empire during its 2 centuries of prosperity. The empire in the time of Trajan. And so the Roman dominions are unshaded. Section 2. The impatient reader of history may be disposed to count the 2 centuries of order between 27 BCE and 180 of the Common Era as among the wasted opportunities of mankind. It was an age of spending rather than of creation, an age of architecture and trade in which the rich grew richer and the poor poorer, and the soul and spirit of man decayed. Looked at superficially, as a man might have looked at it from an aeroplane a couple of thousand feet in the air, there was a considerable flourish of prosperity. Everywhere, from York to Cyrene, from Lisbon to Antioch, he would have noted large with temples, theaters, amphitheaters, markets alike, thousands of such cities supplied by great aqueducts, and served by splendid high roads whose stately remains astonish travelers to this day. He would have noted an abundant civilization and have soared too high to discover that this cultivation was the grudging work of slaves. Upon the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, a considerable traffic would be visible, and the sight of 2 ships alongside each other would not at that altitude reveal the fact that one was a pirate and plundering the other. And even if the observer came down to closer scrutiny, there would still be much accumulated improvement to note. There had been a softening of manners and a general refinement since the days of Julius Caesar. With this, there had been a real increase of humane feeling. Rome was in fact climbing to the level of civilization attained long before by Greece and Babylon and Egypt. During the period of the Antonines, laws for the protection of slaves from extreme cruelty came into existence, and it was no longer permissible to sell them to the gladiatorial schools. Not only were the cities outwardly more splendidly built, but within the homes of the wealthy there had been great advances in the art of decoration. The gross feasting, animal indulgence, and vulgar display of the earlier days of Roman prosperity were now tempered by a certain refinement. Dress had become richer, finer, and more beautiful. There was a great trade in silk with remote China, or the mulberry tree and the silkworm had not yet begun to move west. By the time silk had ended its long and varying journey to Rome, it was worth its weight in gold, yet it was used abundantly, and there was a steady flow of the precious metals eastward in exchange. There had been very considerable advances in gastronomy and the arts of entertainment. Petronius describes a feast given by a wealthy man under the early Caesars, a remarkable succession of courses, some delicious, some amazing, exceeding anything that even the splendors and the imagination of modern New York could produce, and the festival was varied by music and by displays of tightrope dancing, juggling, Homeric recitations, and the like. There was a considerable amount of what we may describe as rich men's culture. Throughout the empire, books were far more plentiful than they had been before the time of the Caesars. Men prided themselves upon their libraries, even when the cares and responsibilities of property made them too busy to give their literary treasures much more than a passing examination. The knowledge of Greek spread eastward and of Latin westward, and if the prominent men of this or that British or Gallic city lacked any profound Greek culture themselves, they could always turn to had been guaranteed of the highest quality by the slave dealer to supply the deficiency. It is quite impossible to deal with either the literature or art of Rome as a thing in itself. Both are a continuation and a part of the much greater and more enduring Hellenic culture. Hellenic art and writing throughout the Latin branch. The mother stem existed before the branch grew out, and went on growing after the branch was withered. The native impulse of the Latin mind in literary expression, before it was deflected by Greek models, was towards a form, if one can call it a form, the satura, a form like a modern review in spirit, a medley of invective, imitation, and music, a sort of bard the Vates, also sang sarcastic verse. That's 9 verses to the peasants, and there were orations, dirges, religious litanies. The satura developed with writing into a form of prose and verse miscellany, and this again into a more continuous prose narrative. Much of the Latin literature is lost. Most of it did not appeal for some reason or other to the Christian monks as worthy of preservation, but as reading and book production spread, there is probably a very considerable diffusion indeed of prose fiction, of which only a few fragments now remain. The Roman people of the later Republic and early Empire was certainly a fiction-reading public. The Satyricon of Petronius, dating from the time of Nero, is most illuminating vestige. No one who has ever written fiction can read that brilliant piece of writing and not recognize its high technical quality. Can't say I've ever read it, so I can't say my opinions of it. Hundreds of such books must have existed, and scores of men must have worked at the art before the Satyricon became possible. Along another line of poetical satire of Horace and Juvenal owes much of the spirit of the satura, and was also a widely diffused type of reading matter. But from the 3rd century BCE onward, the Greek influence imposed the already established forms of the Greek comedy upon the Latin mind, and the Latin comedy is rather a Latinization of that than an indigenous development. Plays by Plautus and Terence are available for the student who wishes to sample their quality. There was also a distinctive Latin tradition of plain, clear prose, which Cato, the censor, did much to sustain. It is interesting to compare Acer Fellow Gallico with Aciditas in its compact accessibility. If one may shock the earnest scholar by a novel but appropriate image, it is like a fitted dressing bag beside a toilet table. The prestige of Greek learning of an approved and settled type was as high in the Rome of Antoninus Pius as it was in the Oxford and Cambridge of Victorian England. The Greek scholar received the same mixture of unintelligent difference and practical contempt. There was a very considerable amount of Greek scholarship and of written criticism and commentary. Indeed, there was so great an admiration for Greek letters as almost completely to destroy the Greek spirit, and the recorded observations of Aristotle were valued so highly as to preclude any attempt to imitate his organization of further inquiry. Cicero rivaled Demosthenes and Sallust, the Greek historians. Catullus learned to reveal his heart from the best Greek models. As Greece had her epics and so forth, the Romans felt, and they too must have their epics. The age of Augustus was an age of splendid insincerities. Virgil in the Aeneid set himself, modestly but resolutely, and with an elegant successfulness, to parallel the Odyssey and Iliad. Ovid and Horace challenge comparison with the best elegiac and lyric poets of Greece. Concurrently with this golden age of Latin literature, the stream of Greek literature continued to flow wide and abundant. Long after the Latin impetus was over, the Hellenic world was still richly productive. It passed without a break into early Christian literature. We have told already of the brilliant intellectual beginnings of Alexandria and of the comparative decline of Athens. If the science of Alexandria presently died away, the literary flow continued in fair rivalry with Rome. There was an immense copying of books without which no rich man's home was complete. History and biography continued. Polybius, circa 204 to 122 BCE, told of the conquest of Greece by Rome. Plutarch, circa 50 to 100, made his incomparable studies of great men. A vast variety of dialogues and novels appeared, and have now, for the most part, disappeared again. A great and original imaginative writer was Lucian, 120 to 200 of the Common Era, who still commands our interest and admiration. There was a considerable amount of translation between Greek and Latin. The two literatures were almost as close, and as much in the same world of thought as the American and English today. All this widespread culture of the wealthy householder is to the credit of the early Roman Empire, and Gibbon makes the most of it in his sunny review of the age of the Antonines, with which he opens his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. One of the books I read in grade school after, in 2018, I think, was when I got a summarized one of that, but there was, I think, Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire was like 6 volumes in the library that when I was in 4th grade. His design for that great work commanded a prelude of splendor and tranquility, but he was far too shrewd and subtle not to qualify his apparent approval of the conditions he describes. Under the Roman Empire, he writes, the labor of an industrious and ingenious people was variously but incessantly employed in the service of the rich. In their dress, their table, their houses, and their furniture, the favorites of fortune united every refinement of convenience, of elegance, and of splendor. Whatever could soothe their pride or gratify their sensuality, such refinements, under the odious name of luxury, have been severely arranged by the moralists of every age, and it might perhaps be more conducive to the virtue as well as happiness of mankind if all possessed the necessaries and none of the superfluities of life. But in the present imperfection condition of society, luxury, though it may proceed from the vice or folly, seems to be the only means that can correct the unequal distribution of property. The diligent mechanic and the skillful artist, who have attained no share in the division of the earth, receive a voluntary tax from the possessors of land, and the latter are prompted, by a sense of interest, to improve those estates with whose produce they may purchase additional pleasure. This operation, the particular effects of which are felt in every society, acted with much more diffuse energy in the Roman world. The provinces would soon have been exhausted of their wealth if the manufactures and commerce of luxury had not insensibly restored to the industrious subjects the sums which were exacted from them by the arms and authority of Rome, and so on, with a sting of satire in every fold of the florid description. If we look a little more widely than a hovering airplane can do at the movement of races upon the earth, or a little more closely than an inspection of streets, amphitheaters, and banquets goes into the souls and thoughts of men, we shall find that this impressive display of material prosperity is merely the shining garment of a polity blind to things without and things within, and blind to the future. If, for instance, we compare the 2 centuries of Roman ascendancy and opportunity, the 1st and 2nd centuries of Common Era, with the 2 centuries of Greek and Hellenic life beginning about 466 BCE, with the supremacy of Pericles in Athens, we are amazed by, we cannot call it an inferiority. It is a complete absence of science. The incuriousness of the Roman rich and the Roman rulers was more massive and monumental even than their architecture. In one field of knowledge, Particularly, we might have expected the Romans to have been alert and enterprising, and that was geography. Their political interests demanded a steadfast inquiry into the state of affairs beyond the frontiers, and yet that inquiry was never made. There is a practicality, no literature of Roman travel beyond the imperial limits. No such keen and curious accounts as Herodotus gives of the Scythians, the Africans, and the like. There is nothing in Latin to compare with the early descriptions of India and Speria that are to be found in Chinese. The Roman legions went at one time into Scotland, and yet there remains no really intelligent account of the Picts or Scots, much less any glance at the seas beyond. Such explorations as those of Hanno or Pharaoh Necho seem to have been altogether beyond the scope of the Roman imagination. It is probable that after the destruction of Carthage, the amount of shipping that went out into the Atlantic through the Strait of Gibraltar fell to inconsiderable proportions. Still more impossible in this world of vulgar wealth, enslaved intelligence, and bureaucratic rule was any further development of the astronomy and physiography of Alexandria. The Romans do not seem even to have inquired what manner of men wove the silk and prepared the spices, or collected the amber and the pearls that came into their markets. Yet the channels of inquiry were open and easy. Pathways led in every direction to the most convenient jumping-off places. For explorers, it is possible to imagine. The most remote countries of the ancient world were ransacked to supply the pomp and delicacy of Rome. The forest of Scythia afforded some valuable furs. Amber was brought overland from the shores of the Baltic to the Danube, and the barbarians were astonished at the price which they received in exchange for so useless a commodity. There was a considerable demand for Babylonian carpets and other manufactures of the East, but the most important branch of foreign trade was carried on with Arabia and India. Every year, about the time of the summer solstice, a fleet of 120 vessels sailed from Myos Hormos, a port of Egypt on the Red Sea. By the periodical assistance of the monsoons, they traversed the ocean in about 40 days. The coast of Malabar, or the island of Ceylon, was the usual term of their navigation, and it was in those markets that the merchants from the more remote countries of Asia expected their arrival. The return of the fleet to Egypt was fixed for the months of December or January, and as soon as the rich cargo had been transported on the backs of camels from the Red Sea to the Nile and had descended that river as far as Alexandria, it was poured without delay into the capital of the empire. And that last paragraph's from Gibbon. There were Roman warehouses in South India, and 2 cohorts were stationed at Cranganore on the Malabar coast, where there was also held to Augustus. Yet Rome was content to feast, exact, grow rich, and watch its gladiatorial shows without the slightest attempt to learn anything of India, China, Persia, or Scythia, Buddha or Zoroaster, or about the Huns, the Negroes, the people of Scandinavia, or the secrets of the Western Sea. When we realize the uninspiring quality of the social atmosphere which made this indifference possible, we are able to account for the failure of Rome during its age of opportunity to develop any physical or chemical science, and as a consequence to gain any increased control over matter. Most of the physicians in Rome were Greeks, and many of them slaves, for the Roman wealthy did not even understand that a bought mind is a spoilt mind, yet this was not due to any want of natural genius among the Roman people. It was due entirely to their social and economic conditions. From the Middle Ages to the present day, Italy has produced a great number of brilliant scientific men, and one of the most shrewd and inspired of scientific writers was an Italian, Lucretius, who lived between the time of Marius and Julius Caesar, about 100 BCE to 55 BCE. This amazing man was of the quality of Leonardo da Vinci, also an Italian, or Newton. He wrote a long Latin poem about the processes of nature, De Rerum Natura, in which he guessed with astonishing insight about the constitution of matter and about the early history of mankind. Osborne, in his Old Stone Age, quotes with admiration long passages from Lucretius about primitive man. So good and true are they today. But this was an individual display, a seed that bore no fruit. Roman science was still born into a suffocating atmosphere of wealth and military expression. The true figure to represent the classical Roman attitude to science is not Lucretius, but that Roman soldier who hacked Archimedes to death at the storming of Syracuse. And if physical and biological science wilted and died on the stony soil of Roman prosperity, political and social science never had a chance to germinate. Political discussion would have been treason to the emperor. Social or economic inquiry would have threatened the rich. So Rome, until disaster fell upon her, never examined into her own social health, never questioned the ultimate value of her hard officialism. Consequently, there was no one who realized the gravity of her failure to develop any intellectual imagination to hold her empire together, any general education and common ideas that would make men fight and work for the empire as men will fight and work for a dear possession. But the rulers of the Roman Empire did not want their citizens to fight for anything in any spirit at all. The rich had eaten the heart out of their general population, and they were content with the meal they had made. The legions were filled with Germans, Britons, Numidians, and the like, and until the very end the wealthy Romans thought they could go on buying barbarians to defend them against the enemy without and the rebel poor within. How little was done in education by the Romans is shown by an account of what was done, says Mr. H. Stuart Jones. Julius Caesar bestowed Roman citizenship on teachers of the liberal arts. Vespasian endowed professorships of Greek and Latin oratory at Rome, and later emperors, especially Antoninus Pius, extended the same benefits to the provinces. Local enterprise and munificence were also devoted to the cause of education. We learn from the correspondence of the younger Pliny that public schools were founded in the towns of northern Italy. But though there was a wide diffusion of knowledge under the empire, there was no true intellectual progress. Augustus, it is true, gathered about him the most brilliant writers of his time, and the debut of his new monarchy coincided with the golden age of Roman literature. But this was of brief duration, and the beginnings of the Christian era saw the triumph of classicism and the first steps in the decline that awaits all literary movements, which look to the past rather than the future. There is a diagnosis of the intellectual decadence of the age in a treatise upon the sublime by a Greek writer who wrote somewhere in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century of the Common Era, and who may possibly have been Longinus Philologus, which states very distinctly one manifest factor in the mental sickness of the Roman world. He is cited by Gibbon, the sublime Longinus, who, in somewhat a later period, in the court of a Syrian queen, Zenobia, preserved the spirit of ancient Athens, observes and laments the degeneracy of his contemporaries, which debased their sentiments, enervated their courage, and depressed their talents. In the same manner, says he, as some children always remain pygmies, whose infant limbs have been too closely confined, thus our tender minds, fettered by the prejudices and habits of a just servitude, are unable to expand themselves or to attain that well-proportioned greatness which we admire in the ancients, who, living under a popular government, wrote with all the same freedom as they acted. But this critic grasp only one aspect of the restraints upon mental activity, the leading strings that kept the Roman mind in a permanent state of infantilism, constituted a double servitude. They were economic as well as political. The account Gibbon gives of the life and activities of a certain Herodotus Atticus, who lived in the time of Hadrian, shows just how little was the share of the ordinary citizen in the outward magnificence of the time. This Atticus had an immense fortune, and he amused himself by huge architectural benefactions to various cities. Athens was given a race course, and a theater of cedar, curiously carved, was set up there to the memory of his wife. A theater was built at Corinth, a race course was given at Delphi, baths to Thermopylae, an aqueduct to Canisium, and so on and so on. One is struck by the spectacle of a world of slaves and common people who were not consulted, and over whose heads, without any participation on their part, this rich man indulged in his displays of taste. Numerous inscriptions in Greece and Asia still preserve the name of Herodes Atticus, patron and benefactor, who ranged about the empire as though it was his private garden. Commemorating himself by these embellishments, he did not confine himself to splendid buildings. He was also a philosopher. Though none of his wisdom has survived, he had a large villa near Athens, and there philosophers were welcome guests, so long as they convinced their patron of the soundness of their pretensions, received his discourses with respect, and did not offend him by insolence. The world, it is evident, was not progressing during these 2 centuries of Roman prosperity, but was it happy in its stagnation? There are signs of a very unmistakable sort that the great mass of human beings in the empire, a mass numbering something between 100 and 150 millions, was not happy, and was probably very acutely miserable beneath its outward magnificence. True, there was no great wars and conquest within the empire, little of famine, or fire, or sword to afflict mankind, but on the other hand, there was a terrible restraint by government, and still more by the property of the rich, upon the free activities of nearly everyone. Life for the great majority, who were neither rich nor official, nor womankind, and the parasites of the rich and official, must have been laborious, tedious, and lacking in interest and freedom to a degree that a modern mind can scarcely imagine. 3 things in particular may be cited to sustain the opinion that this period was a period of widespread unhappiness. The first of these is the extraordinary apathy of the population to political events. We saw one upstart pretender to empire succeed another with complete indifference. Such things did not seem to matter to them. Hope had gone, and presently the barbarians poured into the empire. There was nothing but the legions to face them. There was no popular uprising against them at all. Everywhere the barbarians must have been outnumbered if only the people had resisted. But the people did not resist. It is manifest that to the bulk of its inhabitants, the Roman Empire did not seem to be a thing worth fighting for. To the slaves and common people, the barbarian probably seemed to promise more freedom and less indignity than the pompous rule of the imperial official and grinding employment by the rich. The looting and burning of palaces and an occasional massacre did not shock the folk of the Roman underworld, as it shocked the wealthy and cultured people to whom we owe such accounts as we have of the breaking down of the imperial system. Great numbers of slaves and common people probably joined the barbarians, who knew little of racial or patriotic prejudices and were open-handed to any promising recruit. No doubt, in many cases, the population found that the barbarian was a worse infliction even than the tax gatherer and the slave driver, but that discovery came too late for resistance or the restoration of the old order. And as a second symptom that points to the same conclusion, that life was hardly worth living for the poor and the slaves and the majority of people during the age of the Antonines, we must reckon the steady depopulation of the empire. People refused to have children. They did so, we suggest, because their homes were not safe from oppression, because in the case of slaves there was no security that the husband and wife would not be separated, because there was no pride nor reasonable hope in children anymore. In modern states, the great breeding ground has always been the agricultural countryside, where there is a more or less secure peasantry. But under the Roman Empire, the peasant and the small cultivator was either a worried debtor, or he was held in a network of restraints that made him a spiritless serf, or he had been ousted altogether by the gang production of slaves. A third indication that this outwardly flourishing period was one of deep unhappiness and mental distress for vast multitudes is to be found in the spread of new religious movements throughout the population. We have seen how, in the case of the low country of Judea, the whole nation may be infected by the persuasion that life is unsatisfactory and wrong, and that something is needed to set it right. The mind of the Jews, as we know, had crystallized about the idea of the promise of the one true God and the coming of a Savior or Messiah. Rather different ideas from this were spreading through the Roman Empire. They were that varying answers to one universal question: what must we do for salvation? A frequent and natural consequence of disgust with life as it is, it throws the imagination forward to an afterlife which is to redeem all the miseries and injustices of this one. The belief in such compensation is a great opiate for present miseries. Well, you can refer to causes, stuff you can do amongst stuff beyond your control. Not just say, well, at least it'll be good in the afterlife. But that it could be good in the afterlife, but you know what I mean. Egyptian religion had long been saturated with anticipations of immortality, and as we have seen how central was that idea to the cult of Serapis and Isis at Alexandria, Ost, or is it Yust? Is that how you say Isis? The ancient mysteries of Demeter and Orpheus, the mysteries of the Mediterranean race, revived and made a sort of theocracia with these new cults. A second great religious movement was Mithraism, the development of Zoroastrianism, a religion of very ancient Aryan origin, traceable back to the Indo-Aryan people before they split into Persians and Hindus. We cannot here examine its mysteries in any detail. See League's forerunners and rivals of Christianity. Well, Mithraism was for centuries earlier, and Christianity is a type of Mithraism. Mithras was a god of light, a son of righteousness, with a U, and in the shrines of the cult, he was always represented as slaying a sacred bull whose blood was the seed of life. Suffice it that, complicated with many added ingredients, this worship of Mithras came into the Roman Empire about the time of Pompey the Great, and began to spread very widely under the Khazars and the Antonines. Like the Isis religion, it promised immortality. Its followers were mainly slaves, soldiers, and distressed people. In its methods of worship, in the burning of candles before the altar, and so forth, it has a certain superficial resemblance to the later developments of the ritual of the third great religious movement in the Roman world, Christianity. Christianity also was a doctrine of immortality and salvation, and it too spread at first chiefly among the lowly and unhappy. Christianity has been denounced by modern writers as a slave religion. It took the slaves and downtrodden, and it gave them hope and restored their self-respect, so that they stood up for righteousness like men and faced persecution and torment. Well, Pauline doctrine is to believe and obey whoever's in charge, because even in what seems to be wickedness, I forget the exact quote, that it's obedience to Christ, other religions would say, wait a second, you don't obey when it comes to certain things, right? But of the origins and quality of Christianity, we will tell more fully in a later chapter. The next chapter is Christianity. Section 3. We have said already that the artistic and literary culture of Rome was merely a branch of the great Hellenic culture, which had inherited all that Greece and nearer Asia, Babylon, and Egypt had to bestow. But in certain directions, the Roman system gave very definite thrust of its own, and in none more than in architecture, the Roman Empire marks a new phase of history, a change in scale which was reflected in the greater boldness and larger size of its buildings. The chief gifts of Rome to architecture were cement and the free use of art. Wherever the Roman legions went to arch and cement. Cement rendered possible vast domes and vaults which could be faced with marble. The rich Corinthian column was taken and varied and elaborated and used in conjunction with arches. The arcade is typically Roman. So too is the disposition towards rounded buildings and the superposition of arcades and stories. Wherever the Romans went, they left amphitheaters, triumphal arches, colonnaded streets, aqueducts, and palatial buildings. Also, they made roads with reasonable grades and fine bridges and aqueducts. To this day, The Italian is the finest road maker in the world. The architecture of Rome had no such orderly development as the Egyptian and Greek. Well, when it comes to cements and stuff, maybe, the climate's more suitable for that stuff setting. Its earliest efforts followed upon Etruscan lines and were in timber faced with terracotta. Gradually, stone replaced the timber, but with the coming of the empire, the Greek architect came to Rome and seized upon the new opportunities and materials that offered themselves to him. Roman architecture did not so much develop as break out, but having broken out, it prevailed mightily. A vigorous sculpture, also Greek in its essentials, went with the Roman eagles. A company of big rich men is almost inevitably productive of portraiture, and the vividly individualized portrait bust or statue reached its highest developments under the later Republic and the early Khazars. Painting also continued full of vitality. The fortunate accident of the destruction and preservation of Pompeii and Herculaneum by Vesuvius has enabled the modern world to appreciate the abundance, variety, and beauty of pictorial art in the first century of the Common Era. These palaces were the resorts of the rich, but by no means preeminently rich people, and the wealth of pleasant things they contain gives us the measure of the finer work that is now lost to us. Another type of work in which the early Roman Empire outshone the preceding phase of civilization was the mosaic. Glasswork was also carried to new levels of beauty, chiefly by Greek and Oriental workmen. With the misfortunes and disorders that closed in upon the Western Roman Empire at the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era, a check came to much of its artistic productivity. Portraiture continued, architecture revived again, but after the 3rd century, the fluent naturalism of much of the sculpture stiffened under Oriental influences. Section 4. We have already shown reason for our statement that the Roman imperial system was a very unsound political growth indeed. It is absurd to write of its statecraft. It had none. At its best, it had a bureaucratic administration which kept the peace of the world for a time and failed altogether to secure it. Let us note here the main factors in its failure. The clue to all its Let us note here the main factors in its failure. The clue to all its failure lies in the absence of any free mental activity and any organization for the increase, development, and application of knowledge. It respected wealth and it despised science. It gave government to the rich and imagined that wise men could be bought and bargained for in the slave markets when they were needed. It was, therefore, a colossally ignorant and unimaginative empire. It foresaw nothing, had no strategic foresight because it was blankly ignorant of geography and ethnology. It knew nothing of the conditions of Russia, Central Asia, and East. It was content to keep the Rhine and the Danube as its boundaries and to make no effort to Romanize Germany, but we need only look at the map of Europe and Asia showing the Roman Empire to see that a willing and incorporated Germany was absolutely essential to the life and security of Western Europe. Excluded, Germany became a wedge that needed only the impact of the Hunnish hammer to split up the whole system. Moreover, this neglect to push the boundaries northward to the Baltic left that sea and the North Sea as a region of experiment and training and instruction in seamanship for the Northmen of Scandinavia, Denmark, and the Frisian coast. But Rome went on its way quite stupidly, oblivious to the growth of a newer and more powerful piracy in the north. The same unimaginative quality made the Romans leave the seaways of the Mediterranean undeveloped, when presently the barbarians pressed down to the warm water. We read of no swift transport of armies from Spain or Africa or Asia, the rescue of Italy and the Adriatic coast. Instead we see the Vandals becoming masters of the western Mediterranean without so much as a naval battle. The Romans had been held at the Euphrates by an array of mounted archers. It was clear that the legion was organized as it was useless in wide open country. And it should have been equally clear that sooner or later the mounted nomads of East Germany, South Russia, or Parthia were bound to try conclusions with the empire. But the Romans, 200 years after Castor's time, were still marching about, the same drilled and clanking cohorts they had always been, easily ridden round and shot to pieces. The empire had learnt nothing, even from Farha. The incapacity of the Roman imperialism or novelty in methods of transport again is amazing. It was patent that their power and unity depended upon the swift movement of troops and supplies from one part of the empire to another. The Republic made magnificent roads. The empire never improved upon them. 400 years before the Antonines, Hero of Alexandria had made the first steam engine. Beautiful records of such beginnings of science were among the neglected treasures of the rich men's libraries throughout the imperial domains. They were seed lying on stony ground. The armies and couriers of Marcus Aurelius drudged along the roads exactly as the armies of Scipio Africanus had done 3 centuries before them. The Roman writers were always lamenting the effeminacy of the age. It was their favorite cant. They recognized that the free men of the forest and steppes and desert were harder and more desperate fighters than their citizens, but the natural corollary of developing the industrial power of their accumulations of population to make a countervailing equipment never entered their heads. Instead, they took the barbarians into their legions, taught them the arts of war, marched them about the empire, and returned them with their lesson well learnt to their own people. In view of these obvious negligences, it is no wonder that the Romans disregarded the more subtle thing, the soul of the empire altogether, and made no effort to teach or train or win its common people into any conscious participation with its life. Such teaching or training would indeed have run counter to all the ideas of the rich men and the imperial officials. They had made a tool of religion, science, literature, and education. They had entrusted to the care of slaves who were bred and trained and sold like dogs or horses, ignorant, pompous, and base. The Roman adventurers of finance and property who created the empire lorded it with a sense of the utmost security, while their destruction gathered without the empire and within. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, the overtaxed and the overstrained imperial machine was already staggering towards its downfall. Section 5. And now it is necessary, if we were to understand clearly the true situation of the Roman Empire, to turn our eyes to the world beyond its northern and eastern borders, the world of the plains that stretches with scarcely a break from Holland across Germany and Russia, the mountains of Central Asia and Mongolia, and to give a little attention to its parallel empire in China that was now consolidating and developing a far tougher and more enduring moral and intellectual unity than the Romans ever achieved. Well, I would say it's more ethical than moral, but map of Asia with Europe to illustrate the general conditions of life during the historical period. So we have the northern forest belt, the homelands of the nomads, and the different terrains is listed. It is the practice, says Mr. E.H. Parker, even amongst our most highly educated men in Europe, to deliver sonorous sentences about being masters of the world, bringing all nations of the earth under her sway, and so on, when in reality only some corner of the Mediterranean is involved, or some ephemeral sally into Persia and Gaul. Cyrus and Alexander, Darius and Xerxes, Caesar and Pompey, all made very interesting excursions, but they were certainly not on a larger scale or charged with greater human interest in the campaigns which were going on at the other end of Asia. Western civilization possessed much in art and science for which China never cared, but on the other hand, the Chinese developed the historical and critical literature, a courtesy of demeanor, a luxury of clothing, and an administrative system of which Europe might have been proud. In one word, the history of the Far East is quite as interesting as that of the Far West. It only requires to be able to read it. When we brush away contemptuously from our notice the tremendous events which took place on the plains of Tartary, we must not blame the Chinese too much for not interesting themselves in the doings of what to them appear insignificant states dotted round the Mediterranean and Caspian, which at this time was practically all the world of which we knew in Europe. Each Parker 1,000 years of the Tartars. We have already mentioned the name of Shi Huangti, who consolidated an empire much smaller indeed than the present limits of China, but still very great and populous, spreading from the valleys of the Huanghe and the Yangtze-Kiang. He became king of Xi'an in 246 BCE and emperor in 220 BCE, and he reigned until 210 BCE. And during this third of a century, he effected much the same work of consolidation that Augustus Caesar carried out in Rome 2 centuries later. At his death, there was dynastic trouble for 4 years, and then, 206 BCE, the fresh dynasty, the Han, established itself and ruled for 229 years. The opening quarter century of the Christian era was doubled by a usurper. Then, what is called the later Han dynasty recovered power and ruled for another century and a half until China. And the time of Antoninus was so devastated by an 11-year pestilence as to fall into disorder. The same pestilence, we may note, also helped to produce a century of confusion in the Western world. See section 1. But altogether, until this happened, for more than 400 years, central China was generally at peace, and on the whole, well governed, a cycle of strength and prosperity unparalleled by anything in the experience of the Western world. Only the first of the Han monarchs continued the policy of Shui Huangte against the literati. His successor restored the classics, for the old separatist tradition was broken, and in the uniformity of learning throughout the empire lay, he saw, the cement of Chinese unity. While the Roman world was still blind to the need of any universal mental organization, the Han emperors were setting up a uniform system of education and of literary degrees throughout China that has maintained the intellectual solidarity of that great and always expanding country into modern times. The bureaucrats of Rome were of the most miscellaneous origins and traditions. The bureaucrats of China were and still are made in the same mold, all members of one tradition. Since the Han days, China has experienced great vicissitudes of political fortune, but they have never changed her fundamental character. She has been divided, but she has always recovered her unity. She has been conquered, and she has always absorbed and assimilated her conquerors. But from our present point of view, the most important consequences of this consolidation of China under Shui Huangte and the Hans was in its reaction upon the unsettled tribes of the northern and western border of China. Throughout the disordered centuries before the time of Shui Huangte, and the Heungnu, or Huns, had occupied Mongolia and large portions of northern China, and had raided freely into China and interfered freely into Chinese politics. The new power and organization of the Chinese civilization began to change this state of affairs for good and all. We have already, in our first account of Chinese beginnings, noted the existence of these Huns. It is necessary now to explain briefly who and what they were. Even in using this word Hun as a general equivalent for the Heungnu, we step on to controversial ground. In our accounts of the development of the Western world, we have had an occasion to name the Scythians and to explain the difficulty of distinguishing clearly between the Cimmerians, Sarmatians, Medes, Persians, Parthians, Goths, and other more or less nomadic or more or less Aryan peoples who drifted to and fro in between the Danube and Central Asia. Sections of Aryans were moving south and acquiring and developing civilization. These other Aryan peoples were developing nobility and nomadism. They were learning the life of the tent, the wagon, and the herd. They were learning also to use milk as a food basis, and were probably becoming less agricultural, less exposed to take even snatch crops than they had been. Their development was being aided by a slow change in climate that was replacing the swamps and forests and parklands of South Russia and Central Asia by steppes and wide-ranging land sedges, which favored a healthy, unsettled life and necessitated an annual movement between summer and winter pasture. There's a chapter in the Quran that talks about how people should be grateful for such an ability. These peoples had only the lowest political forms. They split up, they mingled together, the various races had identical social habits, and so it is that the difficulty and possibility of sharp distinctions between them arises. Now the case of the Mongolian races to the north and northwest of the Chinese civilization is very parallel. There can be little doubt that the Xiongnu, the Huns, and the later people called the Mongols were all very much the same people, and that the Turks and the Tartars presently branched off from the same drifting Mongolian population. Kalmuks and Buryats are later developments of the same strain. Here we shall favor the use of the word Hun as a sort of general term to these tribes, just as we have been free and wide in our use of Scythian in the West. The consolidation of China was a very serious matter for these Hunnish peoples. Hitherto, their overflow of population had gone adventuring southward into the disorders of divided China as water goes into a sponge. Now they found a wall built against them, a firm government and disciplined armies cutting them off from the grass plains. And though the wall held them back, it did not hold back the Chinese. They were increasing and multiplying through these centuries of peace, and as they increased and multiplied, they spread steadily with house and plow wherever the soil permitted. They spread westward into Tibet, and northward and northwestwardly, perhaps, to the edge of the Gobi Desert. They spread into the homes and pasturing and hunting grounds of the Hunnish nomads, exactly as the white people of the United States spread westward into the hunting grounds of the Red Indians. And in spite of raid and massacre, they were just as invincible because they had the pressure of numbers and a strong, avenging government behind them. Even without the latter support, the cultivating civilization of China has enormous powers of permeation and extension. It has spread slowly and continuously for 3,000 years. It is spreading in Manchuria and Siberia today. It roots deeply where it spreads. Map of Central Asia in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, mountains and highlands and deserts. Partly the Huns were civilized and assimilated by the Chinese. The more northerly Huns were checked, and their superabundant energies were turned westward. The southern Huns were merged into the imperial population. If the reader will examine the map of Central Asia, he will see that very great mountain barriers separate the southern, western, and eastern peoples of Asia, but he should be wary of forming his ideas from a map upon Mercator's projection, which enormously exaggerates the areas and distances of northern Asia and Siberia. He will find that from the central mountain masses, 3 great mountain systems radiate eastward. The Himalayas, going southeastward, south of Tibet, the Kwenlun, eastward, north of Tibet, and the Tian Shan, northeastward to join the Altai Mountains. Further to the north is the Great Plain, still steadily thawing and drying between the Tian Shan and the Kwenlun is an area. The Tarim Basin equals roughly eastern Turkestan of rivers that never reach the sea, but end in swamps and intermittent lakes. This basin was much more fertile in the past than it is now. The mountain barrier to the west of this Tarim Basin is high, but not forbidding. There are many practicable routes downward into western Turkestan, and it is possible to travel either along northern foothills of the Kwenlun or by the Tarim Valley westward from China to Kashgar, where the roads converge, and so over the mountains to Kokand, Samarkand, and Bukhara. Here, then, is the natural meeting place in the history of Aryan and Mongolian. Here, around by the sea, we have already noted how Alexander the Great came to one side of the barrier in 329 BCE. High among the mountains of Turkestan, a lake preserves his name. Indeed, so living is the tradition of his great raid that almost any stone ruin in Central Asia is still ascribed to Iskander. After this brief glimpse, the light of history upon this region fades again, and when it becomes bright once more, it is on the eastern and not upon the western side. Far away to the east, Shi Huangti had routed the Huns and walled them out of China proper. A portion of these people remained in the north of China, a remnant which was destined to amalgamate with Chinese life under the Huns, but a considerable section and turned westward, and of 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, driven before them a kindred people called the Yuezhi, driving them from the eastern to the western extremity of the Kunlun, and at last right over the barrier into the once Aryan region of western Turkestan. These Yuezhi conquered the slightly Hellenized kingdom of Bactria and mixed with Aryan people there. Later on, these Yuezhi became or were merged with Aryan elements into a people called the Indo-Scythians, who went on down the Khyber Pass and conquered northern portions of India as far as Benares in 100 to 150 of the Common Era, wiping out the last vestiges of Hellenic rule in India. This big splash over the Mongolian races westward was probably not the first of such splashes, but it is the first recorded splash. In the rear of the Yuezhi were the Huns, and in the rear of the Huns, and turning them now northward, was the vigorous Han dynasty of China. In the reign of the greatest of the Han monarchs, Wu Te, 140 to 86 BCE, the Huns had been driven northward out of the whole of eastern Turkestan, are subjugated the Tarim Basin, swarmed with Chinese settlers, and caravans were going over westward with silk and lacquer and jade to trade for the gold and silver of Armenia and Rome. The splash over of the Yuezhi is recorded, but it is fairly evident that much westward movement of sections of the Hunnish peoples is not recorded. From 200 BCE to 200 of the Common Era, the Chinese Empire maintained a hard, resolute, advancing front towards nomadism, and the surplus of the nomads drifted steadily west. There was no such settling down behind a final frontier on the part of the Chinese, as we see in the case of the Romans at the Rhine and Danube. The drift of the nomads before this Chinese thrust, century by century, turned southward, at first towards Bactria. The Parthians of the 1st century BCE probably mingled Scythian and Mongolian elements. The singing arrows that destroyed the army of Crassus came, it would seem, originally from the Altai and the Tian Shan. After the 1st century BCE, the line of greater attraction and least resistance lay for a time towards the north of the Caspian. In a century or so, all the country known as Western Turkestan was Mongolized, and so it remains to this day. A second great thrust by China began about 75 of the Common Era and accelerated the westward drift of the nomads. In 102, Pan Chao, a Chinese general, was sending explorers from his advanced camp upon the Caspian, or as some authorities say, the Persian Gulf, to learn particulars of the Roman power, but the reports decided him not to proceed. By the 1st century of the Common Era, nomadic Mongolian peoples were in evidence upon the eastern boundaries of Europe, already greatly mixed with Nordic nomads and with uprooted Nordic elements from the Caspian Pamir region. There were Hunnish peoples established between the Caspian Sea and the Urals. West of them were the Alans, probably also a Mongolian people with Nordic elements. They had fought against Pompey the Great when he was in Armenia in 65 BCE. These were as yet the farthest westward peoples of the new Mongolian advance, and they made no further westward push until the 4th century of the Common Era. To the northwest, the Finns, a Mongolian people, had long been established as far west as the Baltic. West of the Huns, beyond the Don, there were purely Nordic tribes, the Goths. These Goths had spread southeastward from the region of origin in Scandinavia. They were a Teutonic people, and we have already marked them crossing the Baltic in the map we had given of the earlier distribution of the Aryan-speaking people. These Goths continued to move southeastward across Russia using the rivers and never forgetting their Baltic watercraft. No doubt they assimilated much Scythian population as they spread down to the Black Sea. In the 1st century, the Common Era, they were in two main divisions, the Ostrogoths, the East Goths, who were between the Don and the Dnieper, and the Visigoths, or the West Goths, west of the Dnieper. During the 1st century, there was quiescence over the Great Plains, but population was accumulating and the tribes were fermenting. The 2nd and 3rd centuries seem to have been a phase of comparatively moist seasons and abundant grass. Presently, in the 4th and 5th centuries, the weather grew drier and the grass became scanty, and the nomads stirred afresh. But it is interesting to note that in the opening century, the Christian era, the Chinese Empire was strong enough to expel and push off from itself the surplus of this Mongolian nomadism to the north of it, which presently conquered North India and gathered force and mingled with Aryan nomadism and fell at last like an avalanche upon the weak-backed Roman Empire. Before we go on to tell of the blows that now began to fall upon the Roman Empire, out of the efforts of one or two great men to arrest the collapse, we may say a few words about the habits and quality of these westward drifting barbaric Mongolian peoples who are now spreading from the limits of China toward the Black and Baltic Seas. It is still the European custom to follow the lead of the Roman writers and write of these Huns and their associates as of something incredibly destructive and cruel, but such accounts as we have from the Romans were written in periods of panic, and the Roman could lie about his enemies with a freedom and vigor that must arouse the envy of even the modern propagandist. He could talk of a Punic faith as a byword for perfidy while committing the most abominable treacheries against Carthage, and his railing accusations of systematic cruelty against this people or that, were usually the prelude and excuse for some frightful massacre or enslavement or robbery on his own part. He had quite a modern passion for self-justification. We must remember that these accounts of the savagery and frightfulness of the Huns came from a people whose chief amusement was gladiatorial shows. Oh, what was that show where they had foam padding and stuff, but it was like a gladiatorial thing. Well, there were obstacle courses too, so it wasn't. And whose chief method of dealing with insurrection and sedition was nailing the offender to a cross to die. From first to last, the Roman Empire must have killed hundreds of thousands of men in that way. A large portion of the population of this empire that could complain of the barbarism of its assailants consisted of slaves, subject practically to almost any lust or caprice at the hands of their owners. It is well to bear these facts in mind before we mourn the swamping of the Roman Empire by the barbarians as though it was an extinction of all that is fine in life, by all that is black and ugly. The facts seem to be that the Hunnish peoples were the eastern equivalent of the primitive Aryans, and that in spite of their profound racial and linguistic differences, they mixed with the nomadic and semi-nomadic residuum of the Aryan-speaking races north of the Danube and Persia very easily and successfully. Instead of killing, they enlisted and intermarried with the peoples they invaded. They had that necessary gift for all the peoples destined to political predominance, tolerant assimilation. They came rather later in time, and their nomadic life was more highly developed than that of the primitive Aryans. The primitive Aryans were a forest and ox wagon people who took to the horse later. The Hunnish peoples had grown up with that horse. Someone about 1200 or 1000 years BCE, they began to ride the horse. The bit, the saddle, the stirrup, these are not primitive things, but they are necessary if man and horse are to keep going for long stretches. It is well to bear in mind how modern a thing is riding. Altogether, man has not been in the saddle for much more than 3,000 years. See Roger Pocock's Horses, a very interesting and picturesque little book. We have already noted the gradual appearance of the war chariot, the mounted man, and finally of disciplined cavalry in this history. It was from the Mongolian regions of Asia that these things came. To this day, men in Central Asia go rather in the saddle and on their proper feet. This is Robertson in the History of Mankind, Book 5. See, strong, long-necked horses are found in enormous numbers on the steppes for Mongols and Turkomans. Riding is not a luxury. Even the Mongol shepherds tend their flocks on horseback. Children are taught to ride in early youth, and the boy of 3 years old often takes his first riding lesson on a safe child's saddle and makes quick progress. It is impossible to suppose that the Huns and the Alans could have differed very widely in character from the present nomads of the steppe region, and nearly all observers are agreed in describing these latter as open and pleasant people. They are thoroughly honest and free-spirited. The character of the herdsmen of Central Asia, says Robertson, History of Mankind, Book 5c, when unadulterated, is ponderous, eloquence, frankness, rough good nature, pride, also brings irritability, and a tendency to vindictiveness. Their faces show a considerable share of frankness combined with amusing naivete. Their courage is rather a sudden blaze of pugnacity than cold boldness. Religious fanaticism they have none. Well, depends on what you mean by fanaticism, right? People being devout, I don't like how people will use that term. Oh, fanatics are devout people. No, devout's something different. Fanaticism is when you mistake the teaching or the principle or whatever, or those people who just claim the path and don't act it out. Hospitality is universal. This is not an entirely disagreeable picture. Their personal bearing, he says further, is quieter and more dignified than that of the townsmen of Turkestan and Persia. Add to this that the nomadic life prevents any great class inequalities or any extensive development of slavery. Of course, these peoples out of Asia were totally illiterate and artistically undeveloped, but we must not suppose that on that account that they were primitive barbarians, and that their state of life was at the level from which the agricultural civilization had long ago arisen. It was not. They too had developed, but they had developed along a different line, a line with less intellectual complication, more personal dignity perhaps, and certainly with a more intimate contact with wind and sky. Section 6. The first serious eruptions of the German tribes in the Roman Empire began in the 3rd century with the decay of the central power. We will not entangle the reader here with the vexed and intricate question of the names, identity, and interrelationships of the various Germanic tribes. Historians find great difficulties in keeping them distinct, and these difficulties are enhanced by the fact that they themselves took little care to keep distinct. We find in 236 of the Common Era a people called the Franks breaking bounds upon the Lower Rhine, and another, the Alemanni, pouring into Alsace. A much more serious push southward was that of the Goths. We have already noted the presence of these people in South Russia and their division by the Dnieper into Western and Eastern Goths. They had perhaps become a maritime people again upon the Black Sea. Probably their traditional migration from Sweden was along the waterways where it is still possible to row a boat with only a few quite practicable portages from the Baltic right across Russia, either the Black or Caspian Sea, and they had wrested the command of the eastern seas from the control of Rome. They were presently raiding the shores of Greece. They also crossed the Danube in a great land raid in 247 and defeated and killed the Emperor Decius in what is now Serbia. The province of Dacia vanished from Roman history. In 270 they were defeated at Nish in Siberia by Claudius, and in 247 they were raiding Pontus. It is characteristic of the invertebrate nature of the empire that the legions of Gaul found that the most effective method of dealing with the Franks and the Alemanni at this time was by setting up a separate emperor in Gaul and doing the job by themselves. And for a while the barbarians were held, and the emperor Probus in 276 forced the Franks and the Alemanni back over the Rhine, but it is significant of the general atmosphere of insecurity created by these raids that the Aurelian 270-275 fortified Rome, which had been an open and secure city for all the earlier years of the empire. In 321, the Goths were again over the Danube, plundering what is now Serbia and Bulgaria. They were driven back by Constantine the Great, of whom we shall have more to tell in the next chapter. About the end of his reign, 337 of the Common Era, the Vandals, a people closely kindred to the Goths, being pressed by them, obtained permission to cross the Danube into Pannonia, which is now that part of Hungary west of the river. But by the middle of the 4th century, the Hunnish people to the east were becoming aggressive again. They had long subjugated the Alani, and now they made the Ostrogoths, the East Goths, tributary. The Visigoths, or West Goths, followed the example of the Vandals and made arrangements to cross the Danube into Roman territory. Here we have tracks of various migrating and raiding people between 1 of the Common Era and 700 of the Common Era. The reader must bear in mind that there was also an annual north and south oscillation between summer and winter pastures of all the nomadic peoples. And nowadays you have rich people that go north and south for weather and daylight reasons. There was some dispute upon the terms of this settlement, and the Visigoths, growing fierce, assumed the offensive, and at Adrianople defeated the Emperor Valens, who was killed in this battle. They were then allowed to settle in what is now Bulgaria, and their army became nominally a Roman army, although they retained their own chiefs, the foremost of whom was Alaric. It exhibits the complete barbarization of the Roman Empire that had already occurred, that the chief opponent of the Alaric, the Goth, Stilicho, was a Pannonian Vandal. The legions in Gaul were under the command of a Frank, and the Emperor Theodosius I, whose empire was 379 to 395 the Common Era, was a Spaniard, chiefly supported by Gothic auxiliaries. The empire was now split finally into an eastern Greek-speaking and a western Latin-speaking half. Theodosius the Great was succeeded by his sons Arcadius at Constantinople and Honorius at Ravenna. Alaric made a puppet of the eastern monarch and Stilicho of the western. Huns now first appear within the empire as auxiliary troops enlisted under Stilicho. In the struggle of east and west, the frontier, if we can still speak of a frontier between the unauthorized barbarian without and the barbarian in employment within, gave way. Fresh Vandals, more Goths, Alans, Suevi marched freely westward, living upon the country. Amidst this confusion occurred a crowning event. Alaric the Goth marched down Italy, and after a short siege captured Rome, 410. By 425 or so, the Vandals, whom originally we noted in East Germany, and a portion of the Alani, whom we first mentioned in southeast Russia, had traversed Gaul and the Pyrenees and had amalgamated and settled in the south of Spain. There were Huns in possession of Pannonia and Goths in Dalmatia, in Bohemia and Moravia, came and settled with the Slavic people. The Czechs, 451 of the Common Era, in Portugal and north of the Vandals in Spain were Visigoths and Suevi. Gaul was divided among Visigoths, Franks, and Burgundians. Britain was being invaded by Low German tribes, the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons. before whom the Celtic British at the southwest were flying across the sea to what is now Britain and France. The usual date given for this invasion is 449, but it was probably earlier, and as the result of intrigues between two imperial politicians, the Vandals of the south of Spain under the king Genseric embarked en masse for North Africa, 429, became masters of Carthage, 439, secured the mastery of the sea, raided, captured, and pillaged Rome, 455, crossed into Sicily, and set up a kingdom in West Sicily, which endured there for 100 years, up to 534 at the time of its greatest extent, 477. This Vandal kingdom included also Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearic Isles, as well as much of North Africa. About this Vandal kingdom, facts and figures are given that show very clearly the true nature of these barbarian eruptions. They were not really the conquest and replacement of one people or race or by another. What happened was something quite different. It was a social revolution started and maxed by a superficial foreign conquest. The whole Vandal nation, men, women, and children that came from Spain to Africa, for example, did not number more than 80,000 souls. We know this because we have particulars of the transport problem in their struggle for North Africa. Dr. Schultz tells us in Helmont's History of the World, there is no trace of any serious resistance offered by the inhabitants. Boniface, the Roman governor North Africa, had defended Hippo with Gothic mercenaries, while the native population lent no appreciable assistance, and the nomad tribes of the country either adopted a dubious attitude or availed themselves of the difficulties of the Roman governor to make attacks and engage in predatory expeditions. This demoralization resulted from social conditions which had perhaps developed more unfavorably in Africa than in other parts of the Roman Empire. The free peasants had long ago become the serfs of the great landed proprietors and were little superior in position to the masses of slaves who were everywhere to be found, and the great landowners had become in their turn easy victims of the policy of extortion followed by unscrupulous governors to an increasingly unprecedented extent and proportions as the dignity of the imperial power sank lower. No man who had anything to lose would now take a place in the Senate of the large towns, which had once been the goal of the ambitious, for the senators were required to make up all deficiencies in the revenues, and such deficiencies were now frequent and considerable. Bloody insurrections repeatedly broke out, always traceable ultimately to the pressure of taxation. Manifestly, the Vandals came in as a positive relief to such a system. They exterminated the great landowners, wiped out all debts to Roman moneylenders, and abolished the last vestiges of military service. The cultivators found themselves better off. The minor officials kept their places. It was not so much a conquest as a liberation from an intolerable deadlock. It was, while the Vandals were still in Africa, that a great leader, Attila, arose among the Huns. The seat of his government was in the plains east of the Danube. For a time he swayed a considerable empire of Hunnish and Germanic tribes, and his rule stretched from the Rhine into Central Asia. He negotiated on equal terms with the Chinese emperor. He bullied Ravenna and Constantinople for 10 years. Amuria, the granddaughter of Theodosius II, emperor of the Eastern Empire, one of those passionate young ladies who cause so much trouble in the world, having been put under restraint because of a love affair with a court chamberlain, sent her ring to Attila and called upon him to be her husband and deliverer. He was also urged to attack the Eastern Empire by Genseric the Vandal, who was faced by an alliance of the Western and Eastern emperors. He raided southward to the very walls of Constantinople, completely destroying Gisgibbon's 70 cities in his progress and forcing upon the emperor an onerous place, which apparently did not involve the liberation of Honoria to her hero. At this distance of time, we are unable to guess at the motives for this omission. Attila continued to speak of her as his affianced bride, and to use the relationship for progression. In the subsequent negotiations, a certain Priscus accompanied an embassy to the camp of the Hunnish monarch, and the fragments that still survive of the narrative he wrote give us a glimpse of the camp and a way of living of the great conqueror. the Eastern Roman Empire, about 500 of the Common Era, when Theodoric was king of Italy and Sicily and nominally subject to the emperor at Constantinople. The embassy was itself a curiously constituted body. Its head was Maximin, an honest diplomatist who went in good faith, quite unknown to him, and at the time to Priscus Vigilius, the interpreter of the expedition, had also a secret mission from the court of Theodosius, which was to secure by bribery the assassination of Attila. The little expedition went by way of Nish, crossed the Danube in canoes dug out of a single tree, and it was fed by contributions from the villages on the route. Differences in dietary soon attracted the attention of the envoys. Priscus mentions mead in the place of wine, millet or corn. Well, millet was their grain, basically. And a drink either distilled, according to Gibbon, or brewed from barley. And it throws you off sometimes because you automatically think of the stuff with ears as corn when they meant stuff in sheaths like barley and wheat. The journey through Hungary will remind the reader in many of its incidents of the journeys of travelers in Central Africa. During the Victorian period, the travelers were politely offered temporary wives. Attila's capital was rather a vast camp and village than a town. There was only one building of stone, a bath constructed on the low level. The rest of the people were in huts and tents. Attila and his leading men lived in timber palaces in great stockaded enclosures with their numerous wives and ministers about them. There was a vast display of loot, but Attila himself affected a nomadic simplicity. He was served in wooden cups and platters and never touched bread. He worked hard, kept open court before the gate of his palace, and was commonly in the saddle. The primitive custom of both Aryans and Mongols of holding great feasts in halls still held good, and there was much hard drinking. Priscus describes how bards chanted before Attila. They recited the verses which they had composed to celebrate his valor and his victories. A profound silence prevailed in the hall, and the attention of the guests was captivated by the vocal harmony, which revived and perpetuated the memory of their own exploits. A martial ardor flashed from the eyes of the warriors who were impatient for battle, and the tears of the old men expressed their generous despair that they could no longer partake of the danger and glory of the field. This entertainment, which might be considered as a school of military virtue, was succeeded by a farce that debased the dignity of human nature. A Moorish and Scythian buffoon successfully excited the mirth of the rude spectators by their deformed figures, ridiculous dress, antic gestures, obscure speeches, and the strange, unintelligible confusion of the Latin, the Gothic, and the Hunnish languages. And the hall resounded with loud and licentious peals of laughter. In the midst of this intemperate riot, Attila alone, without change of countenance, maintained his steadfast and inflexible gravity, according to Gibbon. Although Attila was aware, through the confession of the proposed assassin, of the secret work of Vigilius, he allowed this embassy to return in safety, with presents of numerous horses and the like, to Constantinople. Then he dispatched an ambassador to Theodosius II to give that monarch, as people say, a piece of his mind. Theodosius, said the envoy, is the son of an illustrious and respectable parent. Attila, likewise, is descended from a noble race, and he has supported by his actions the dignity which he inherited from his father, Munzuk. Theodosius has forfeited his parental honors, and by consenting to pay tribute has degraded himself to the condition of a slave. It is therefore just that he should reverence the man whom fortune and merit have placed above him, instead of attempting, like a wicked slave, clandestinely to conspire against his master. This straightforward bullying was met by abject submission. The emperor sued for pardon and paid a great ransom. In 451, Attila declared war on the Western Empire. He invaded Gaul. So far as the imperial forces were concerned, he had things all his own way, and he sacked most of the towns of France as far south as Orleans. Then Franks and Visigoths and the imperial forces united against him, and a great and obstinate battle at Troyes, 451, in which over 150,000 men were killed on both sides, ended in his repulse and saved Europe from a Mongolian overlord. This disaster by no means exhausted Attila's resources. He turned his attention southward and overran North Italy. He burnt Aquileia and Padua and looted Milan, but he made peace at the entreaty of Pope Leo I. He died in 453. Hereafter, the Huns, so far as that name goes in Europe, the Huns of Attila, disappeared out of history. They dissolved into the surrounding populations. They were probably already much mixed and rather Aryan and Mongolian. They did not become, as one might suppose, inhabitants of Hungary, though they have probably left many descendants there. About 100 years after came another Hunnish or mixed people, the Avars, out of the east into Hungary, but these were driven out eastward again by Charlemagne in 791 to 795. The Magyars, the modern Hungarians, came westward later. They were a Turco-Finnish people. The Magyar is a language belonging to the Finno-Ugrian division of the Ural-Altaic tongues. The Magyars were on the Volga about 550. They settled in Hungary about 900, but we're getting too far. In our story, and we must return to Rome. In 493, Theodoric, a Goth, became king of Rome, but already for 17 years there had been no Roman emperor. So it was in utter social decay and collapse that the great slave-holding world ascendancy of the god Khazars and the rich men of Rome came to an end. Section 7. But throughout the whole of Western Europe and North Africa, the Roman imperial system had collapsed. Though credit had vanished, luxury production had ceased, and money was sitting. Though creditors were going unpaid and slaves masterless, the tradition of the Khazars was still being carried on in Constantinople. We have already had occasion to mention as two outstanding figures among the late Khazars, Diocletian, 284, and Constantine the Great, 312, and it was to the latter of these that the world owes the setting up of a fresh imperial center at Constantinople. Istanbul's Constantinople, very early during the imperial period, the unsuitability of the position of Rome as a world capital due to the Roman failure to use the sea was felt. The destruction of Carthage and Corinth had killed the shipping of the main Mediterranean sea routes for a people who did not use the sea properly. Having the administrative center at Rome meant that every legion, every draft of officials, every order had to travel northward for half the length of Italy before it could turn east or west. Consequently, nearly all the more capable emperors set up their headquarters at some subordinate center in a more convenient position. Sirmium on the river Save, Milan, Lyons, Nicomedia, and Bithynia were among such supplementary capitals. For a time under Diocletian, Durazzo was the imperial capital. Ravenna, near the head of the Adriatic, was the capital of the last Roman emperors. In the time of Alaric and Stilicho, it was Constantine the Great who determined upon the permanent transfer of the center of imperial power, the Bosphorus. We have already noted the existence of the city of Byzantium which Constantine chose to develop into his new capital. It played a part in the story of the intricate Histiaas, a repulsed Philip of Macedon. If the reader will examine its position, he will see that in the hands of a line of capable emperors, and as the center of the people, with some solidarity and spirit in seacraft, neither which things was vouchsafed to it, it was extraordinarily well placed. Its galleys could have penetrated up the rivers to the heart of Russia and outflanked every barbarian advance. It commanded practicable trade routes to the east and was within a reasonable striking distance of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and all the more prosperous and civilized regions of the world at that period, and even under the rule of a series of inept monarchs and under demoralized social conditions. The remains of the Roman Empire, centering at Constantinople, held out for nearly 1,000 years. It was the manifest intention of Constantine the Great that Constantinople should be the center of an undivided empire, but having regard to the methods of travel and transport available at the time, the geographical conditions of Europe and Western Asia do not point to any one necessary center of government. If Rome faced westward instead of eastward, and so failed to reach out beyond the Euphrates, Constantinople, on the other hand, was hopelessly remote from Gaul. The enfeebled Mediterranean civilization, after a certain struggle for Italy, did in fact let go of the West altogether and concentrated upon what were practically the central vestiges, the stump of the empire of Alexander. The Greek language resumed its sway, which had never been very seriously undermined by the official use of Latin. This Eastern or Byzantine empire is generally spoken of as if it were a continuation of the Roman tradition. It is really far more like a resumption of Alexander's. The Latin language had not the intellectual vigor behind it. It had not the literature and the science to make it a necessity to intelligent men, and so to maintain an ascendancy over the Greek, for no language, whatever officialdom may do, can impose itself in competition with another that can offer the advantages of great literature are encyclopedic information. Aggressive languages must bring gifts, and the gifts of Greek were incomparably greater than the gifts of Latin. The Eastern Empire was from the beginnings of its separation Greek-speaking, and a continuation, though a degenerate continuation, of the Hellenic tradition. Its intellectual center was no longer in Greece. So, one last map of this chapter. The map to illustrate the geographical advantages of Constantinople. Well, a lot of cultures have said that they were the center of the world, and well, they were the center of their world, and there's something to be said for that. Gun, Germs, and Steel book that someone just went way too far with their belief in it, or maybe I didn't even read the book, so I'm not even sure that it quite made the point that blood and soil was the only thing that kind of put things about, oh, well, they didn't really go into blood, but you know what I mean, the resources. And well, your ability to process diseases and stuff, a lot of that is inherited. Its mentality was no longer the mentality of free-minded, plain-speaking citizens of the Stagirite Aristotle and the Greek Plato. Its mentality was a mentality of the pedants and of men politically important. Its philosophy was a pompous invasion of real things, and its scientific impulse was dead. Nevertheless, it was Hellenic and not Latin. The Rome had come, and he had gone again. Oh, the Roman, okay. Indeed, he had gone very extensively from the west also. By the 6th century of the Common Era, the populations of Europe and North Africa had been stirred up like sediment, when presently, in the 7th and 8th centuries, the sediment begins to settle down again and populations begin to take on a definite localized character. The Roman is only to be found by name in the region about Rome. Over large parts of his Western Empire, we find changed and changing modifications of his Latin speech. In Gaul, where the Frank is learning a Gallic form of Latin and evolving French in the process. In Italy, where under the influence of Teutonic invaders, the Lombards and Goths, Latin is being modified into various Italian dialects. In Spain and Portugal, where it is becoming Spanish and Portuguese, the fundamental Latinity of the languages in these regions serves to remind us of the numerical unimportance of the various Frankish, Vandal, Avar, Gothic, and the like German-speaking invaders, and serves to justify our statement that what happened to the Western Empire was not so much conquest and the replacement of one population by another as a political and social revolution. The district of Valais in South Switzerland also retained fundamentally Latin speech, and so did the Canton Grisons. And what is more curious and interesting is that in Dacia and Moesia Inferior, large parts of which to the north of the Danube became the modern Romania, although these regions were added late to the empire and soon lost, the Latin speech also remained. In Britain, Latin was practically wiped out by the conquering Anglo-Saxons, from among whose various dialects the root stock of English presently grew. But while the smashing of the Roman social and political structure was thus complete, while in the East it was thrown off by the older and stronger Hellenic tradition, and while in the West it was broken up into fragments that began to take on a new and separate life of their own, there was one thing that did not perish, but grew, and that was the tradition of the world empire of Rome and of the supremacy of the Khazars. When the reality was destroyed, the legend had freedom to expand. Removed from the possibility of verification, the idea of a serene and splendid Roman world supremacy grew up in the imagination of mankind and still holds it to this day. Ever since the time of Alexander, human thought has been haunted by the possible political unity of the race. All the sturdy chiefs and leaders and kings of the barbarians who raided through the prostrate but vast disorder of the decayed empire were capable of conceiving some mighty king of kings rather than themselves, and giving a real law for all men, and they were ready to believe that elsewhere in space and time, and capable of returning presently to resume his supremacy, Khazar had been such a king of kings, far above their own titles. Therefore, they esteemed and envied the title of Khazar. The international history of Europe from this time henceforth is largely the story of kings and adventurers setting up to be Khazar and emperor. We shall tell of some of them in their places. So universal did this Khazarian become that the Great War of 1914 to 1918 mowed down no fewer than 4 Khazars. The German Kaiser is Khazar, the Austrian Kaiser, the Tsar, Khazar of Russia, and that fantastic figure, the Tsar of Bulgaria. The French Imperator Napoleon III had already fallen by 1871, the last monarch in the world to carry on the imperial title and the tradition of Divas Khazar was the British king, who until after the Second World War was called the Khazar of India, a country no real Khazar ever looked upon. Kaiser Hind, this he inherited from the great Mongol, of whom we shall tell in due course.